Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the events surrounding what became known as the Preppy murder in New York City. Back in the 1980s, New York was a very different city from the one it is today. An illegal drug epidemic was raging, and crime rates, including murders, were at record highs. Times Square earned the nickname of Needle Park due to the widespread heroin use. Homelessness was high, and sex workers were working openly across the city. Despite the grittiness, danger, and graffiti of New York, the lure of city life, the music, fashion, shops, nightclubs, and bars appealed to many people at the time. One such person was Jennifer Dawn Levin. Born on the 21st of May 1968 in Nassau County, New York, Jennifer was the second daughter of Ellen and Stephen Levin. Jennifer's early years were spent with her parents and older sister Danielle living in Long Island. Ellen and Stephen divorced in the early 1970s, and Stephen went on to remarry a woman by the name of Arlene. Stephen was an extremely successful real estate agent in Soho, New York. Jennifer and Danielle remained close to both of their parents, and Jennifer grew into an independent, bubbly young lady who had a love of life. She attended the prestigious Baldwin School, a girls' private school on West 47th Street in New York, and during this time lived with her father and stepmother at their luxury loft in Soho. Despite coming from a wealthy family and enjoying the level of privilege this gave her, those who knew her said that she was well grounded and did not take her lifestyle for granted. Jennifer achieved good grades at school and graduated in June 1986. She was due to start at Chamberlain Junior College in Boston that September, where she planned to major in marketing. Jennifer and her friends made the most of the summer of 1986 before they went their separate ways to various colleges. At the time, fake IDs were common, and Jennifer and her friends became regulars at a bar named Dorian's on East 84th Street on the Upper East Side. Dorian's was a well-known hangout for many of the privileged kids who lived in the exclusive Upper East Side. This was perhaps due to the fact that they were very relaxed about checking IDs. The legal drinking age was 21 in New York, but many of the clientele at the bar were far younger. Jennifer spent the summer working at Fluty's Pier 17, a South Street seaport restaurant, before holidaying in California with friends. When she returned from her holiday, she spent her time partying with her friends in New York and was enjoying life to the full before moving on to the next chapter in Boston. On Tuesday, the 26th of August 1986, an equity trader by the name of Pat Riley was cycling through Central Park at around 6 a.m. As she approached the area near 5th Avenue and 83rd Street, which was behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art, she saw the body of a young woman under a tree. Even at a distance, she could tell that something was very wrong and immediately cycled to a phone booth to call 911. She returned to stay with the body until the emergency services arrived. The woman had tan lines which showed that her bracelets and rings were missing. Her denim jacket was on the floor next to her. Her skirt and top were both pushed up, and her underwear was found about 50 meters away. There had been no attempt to hide the body. It was clearly visible from the footpath. Detectives initially worked on the assumption that the young woman was sexually assaulted, robbed, and killed by a stranger before being dumped in Central Park. Even though the crime rate was very high in the city at the time, a murder in this exclusive neighborhood was far less common and immediately attracted the attention of the press. The young woman was identified as being Jennifer Levin, and the police went to Stephen Levin's house at around 9:30 a.m. that morning to break the news to him. Almost immediately, the press got hold of Stephen's address, and a media circus soon followed the police to the house. Jennifer's mother, who had been notified of her daughter's death, but not the circumstance of it, arrived at her ex-husband's house to a sea of reporters. It was only when she got inside that Ellen found out from her mother that Jennifer had been murdered. Jennifer's body was taken to the morgue where her injuries were documented. She had multiple abrasions, contusions, and bite marks. She had extensive bruising on her face and neck. Her teeth were loose, and her left eye was bulging out of its socket. Her fingernails were damaged, and it was determined that she had put up a determined fight with her attacker. Detectives began piecing together Jennifer's last steps. She had spent the evening on the Upper East Side with her friend Alex Lagata. Alex confirmed that they had been at Dorian's bar and informed the police of the other people who they were with. As the police continued to question the people who had been at Dorian's the night before, the trail eventually led to a young man by the name of Robert Chambers. Robert ran in the same social circles as Jennifer and Alex. The police arrived at Robert's house on East 90th Street to gather more information, allowing them to build a picture of what had happened the night before. As they knocked on the door, Robert's mother answered and said that he was still asleep. Then, when Robert appeared, he immediately went from someone who could help set the scene to a person of interest in the case. He had deep, fresh scratches on his face and clearly had an injury on his right hand. He dismissed the scratches, which he said had been caused by his pet cat. Robert was very cooperative and voluntarily went to the police station to help the detectives with their inquiries. As the police asked him about the night before, he stated that he knew Jennifer and had last seen her outside Dorian's, where they had said goodnight and parted ways. He was well spoken and relaxed as he talked, and the conversation progressed over the next couple of hours until he mentioned that he and Jennifer had walked up 86th Street, contradicting his previous statement. Robert then agreed to a video statement where he changed his story of what had happened that evening. Robert informed the police that he had arrived at Dorian's quite late, around 11:30 p.m, and at around midnight, Jennifer came over and started talking to him. The pair had hooked up a few times previously, and it seemed that she wanted more from him that night. He stated that he wasn't interested in Jennifer, but she asked to speak to him outside, and he agreed. He said that they began walking up 86th Street, and that Jennifer had suggested that they go into the park. He stated that he told Jennifer that he wasn't interested in her and that he wanted to see other people. At this point, she allegedly freaked out and started to lash out at him, scratching his face. He had wanted to leave, but she convinced him to stay and talk. He continued recounting the events, stating that she had wanted to go to the bathroom, so he sat and waited for her. When she returned, he said that he was sitting with his hands behind his back and that she used her underwear to tie his hands together. At that point, he claimed that she climbed on top of him, sat on his chest, facing his feet, and began to sexually assault him. He then stated that she began grabbing his genitals and caused him exceptional pain, at which point he managed to free his left hand, grab her by the neck, and flip her off of him. He said that she landed next to the tree and did not move. He initially thought she was kidding around, but when he realised that she wasn't, he became scared. He said that he didn't want to touch her, and so he didn't help her in any way. Instead, he walked across the street and sat and stared until the police arrived at the crime scene. At this point, he went home and went to bed. When he awoke, he thought the whole thing had been a bad dream until the police arrived to question him. Throughout recounting this ordeal, Robert talked freely, not seeming nervous, and at no point asked for a lawyer. He claimed that the whole thing was an accident. The interviewing officers simply did not believe his version of events. He was 6'4" and weighed around 220 pounds, and she was around 5'6" and weighed about 100 pounds less than him. The photos of Jennifer's body showed extensive injuries, which did not tally with his version of events. Robert, however, stuck to this story that he had been sexually attacked and Jennifer's death was an accident, and he seemed genuinely shocked when he was informed that he was being charged with her murder, mumbling, "What's mother gonna say?" The media coverage was extensive and relentless. Although the murder rate in New York City was very high at the time, this case was different. With two beautiful, young, privileged teens involved, many of the tabloids played the story out like a cheap soap opera, forgetting the tragedy and emotions of the real people who were involved. Facing a second-degree murder charge, which carried a maximum sentence of life in prison, Robert was represented by Jack Lippman. He was a defense lawyer who made no bones about the fact that he would do anything within the bounds of the law to protect his clients. He had no qualms about attacking the victims of crime and happily took on a victim-blaming defense in this case. Robert entered a plea of not guilty, claiming that this was an accidental killing, and he was held at Rikers Island, awaiting a bail hearing at the end of September. It was assumed that, because of the nature of the crime, that bail would be unlikely, but Jack played heavily on Robert's good family, good education, and that this was his first offence. In addition, the Archbishop of Newark, Theodore Edgar McCarrick, wrote a letter of support for Robert's bail application. Robert's mother, Phyllis, was very religious and had cared for Cardinal Terence Cook in his final days, and the Archbishop had become Robert's godfather. This threw the weight of the Catholic Church behind Robert at a time when the church was extremely powerful in New York. Bail was set at $150,000, an amount which was impossible for the family to meet. However, with the support of the church, together with the bar owner, Jack Dorian, putting his townhouse up as collateral, the bail was met. On the 1st of October 1986, Robert was released on bail. His lawyer, Jack Lippman, held a conference where Robert read a prepared statement stating that Jennifer's death had been an accident. During his time on bail, he lived with a priest working for a weekly wage of $134. Jack Lippman portrayed him as a handsome young man surrounded by upstanding members of the church, presenting the image that he was a good person and not a violent murderer. The prosecutors in the case looked to contradict this image and began to delve into Robert's background. Robert was born on the 25th of September 1966. He was the only child of Phyllis and Robert Sr. The family were comfortable, but not as wealthy as their Upper East Side address would lead people to believe. Phyllis was determined that her only son would succeed in life, and through a combination of contacts made through her nursing work, the church, and scholarships, Robert attended some of the most competitive schools in the area. When he was 8 years old, he joined the Knickerbocker Greys, an elite military drill group which boasted Vanderbilts and Roosevelts amongst its members. He was also an altar boy at St. Thomas More, and he generally thrived in the sheltered setting of these activities. He was shy yet popular and continued to do well in school, but after he moved to Choate Prep School in Wallingford, Connecticut, when he was around 14 years old, he began to struggle academically. At around the same time, his father became increasingly distant and started to struggle with alcoholism. Due to poor grades, he was not invited back for a second year at Choate, and he started at the Browning School, where his academic decline accelerated. He began experimenting with drugs from a young age and became a regular on the New York social scene. His mother constantly pushed him into joining the elite world of the super rich, but his lack of effort with his schoolwork gave him no way of doing this. He was socialising with the people that his mother wanted him to be, with no way of keeping up with them. By 1984, his parents had separated, and his drug use was accelerating. He began to steal from friends and their families, and despite this being well known within his social circles, no one seemed to care, and if they did, they didn't do anything about it. He did manage to graduate and was accepted at the College of Basic Studies at Boston University. This was a program designed to help those who had problems in high school. However, after just one term, he was asked to leave after it had been found that he had stolen a credit card. He returned to New York, and unable to get a job, he headed deeper into the world of illegal drugs. Together with an accomplice, he would break into apartments on the Upper East Side when he knew the owners would not be home. With his preppy looks and contacts in the city, he would be greeted by the doorman and let into the building. He would then gain access into individual apartments, taking jewellery, cash and furs, which he would hand to his accomplice, who would be waiting on the fire escape. The accomplice, David Filial, was later charged with the sexual assault and attempted murder of a Columbia student in her dorm room. In April 1986, Robert checked into the Hazelden Clinic in Minnesota to get treatment for his addictions. The treatment was meant to last for 6 months, but he soon checked himself out and returned to New York City. His mother was upset that he had dropped out of the program, and he spent some time living in the basement with the building supervisor, who he helped paint the building to earn his keep. During the summer of 1986, he dated Jennifer a handful of times, but was also seeing other people. He became involved with another girl by the name of Alex Kapp. She was due to meet him at Dorian's on the night of the murder. That night, Robert had turned up late and ignored Alex, and she was furious. They argued, and she threw some condoms in his face, stating that he would not get to use them with her. Robert became really mad that Alex had embarrassed him, and it was not long after this that he was approached by Jennifer. They left the bar together in the early hours of the morning, walking up 86th Street towards Central Park. After that, no one knows the exact truth of what happened except Robert. The prosecution were emphatic that Robert was guilty of murder. They now knew he was a thief and drug addict, and not the good religious boy that the defence were trying to portray. Jack Lippman, Robert's lawyer, was working on a defence which flipped the story of that night. He painted Jennifer as a promiscuous bad girl who had been accidentally killed during a rough sex session. Some tabloid newspapers latched onto this, and headlines such as "How Jennifer Courted Death," "Woman's Advances Led to Her Death," and "Jenny Killed in Wild Sex" started appearing on newsstands. Much was made in the press about a so-called sex diary which it was claimed Jennifer had kept. The defence subpoenaed the diary, and a legal battle followed regarding Jennifer's entitlement to privacy after her death. The diary was eventually reviewed in the judge's chambers, where it was shown to be nothing more than a date book which had been kept in the family kitchen. However, the tabloid headlines which referenced a sex diary stuck. It was ultimately decided that it would not form part of the defence at trial. Many people started to believe the narrative that this good-looking, white, preppy male couldn't possibly have committed such an aggressive crime. Therefore, it had to be just an unfortunate accident. During his time on bail, Robert would regularly be pictured out and about, visiting restaurants, and seemed very nonchalant about the whole affair. As evidence of his involvement in burglaries came to light, Jack Lippman was keen to keep a more attractive view of Robert in the public domain. He arranged an interview with New York Magazine, where Robert was featured on the front cover, looking more like a male model than a cold-blooded killer. However, many saw through this blatant attack to build up Robert's character while systematically demolishing Jennifer's, and were outraged by it. The activist Rose Jordan, along with the crime prevention group, the Guardian Angels, started to get vocal about the case, and Justice for Jennifer pin badges were being sold on the streets of New York. This gave Jennifer's family a much-needed lift after seeing the memory of their daughter tarnished in the press. The prosecution thought they had the final piece to guarantee their victory at trial when a newly developed DNA test proved that Jennifer's jacket had been used to restrain and smother her, thus giving them the murder weapon. They received another setback when, during a pre-trial motion, this was excluded from being used in court due to the infancy of the technology at the time. In October 1987, jury selection began, a process which took several months due to the notoriety of the case, and the trial began in January 1988. The prosecution showed the level of injuries which Jennifer had sustained, stating that it would have required continuous application of force to kill her and cause these injuries. The defence stuck to their argument that Robert had reacted to the extreme pain which he was in, and Jennifer's death had been a tragic accident. The prosecution claimed that the injury Robert had sustained to his hand that night, a broken fifth metacarpal, was consistent with him administering forceful blows, which was also consistent with the injuries Jennifer had on the left side of her face. The defence stated that he had hurt his hand when he fell back as he pushed Jennifer off of him. The prosecution showed the injuries to Jennifer's hands, which they believed proved how she had been literally fighting for her life. The level of sexism in the trial was extreme. Robert's lawyers did everything they could to make it seem that Jennifer was in some way deviant and perhaps deserved what she got. Robert remained emotionless, staring ahead for the duration of the trial. To the disappointment of the prosecutors, he did not take the stand. He was supported in court each day by his parents and his girlfriend, Sean Covell. On 17th of March 1988, the jury began their deliberations. The biggest sticking point was intent. Did he intentionally kill her? The jury was split. After 9 days of deadlock, it was clear that the jury could not reach a unanimous decision that was beyond a reasonable doubt. At this point, the defence contacted the prosecutors to see if they could agree on a plea. It was agreed that Robert could plead guilty to manslaughter in the first degree, and as such there was no necessity to prove intent. When this was presented to Jennifer's family, they were understandably devastated. The punishment for manslaughter in the first degree was 5 to 15 years. Robert could be a free man again while he was still in his mid-20s. However, the alternative was for him to be freed awaiting a new trial, and the family would then have to go through the ordeal all over again with no guarantee of a better outcome. The plea was agreed. Robert was allowed to return home with his parents for one last night before he arrived at prison to begin his 5 to 15-year sentence. The Levin family filed a wrongful death suit seeking $25 million in damages, to which Robert pleaded no contest. He was ordered to pay any lump sums which he received to the Levin family, along with 10% of his wages, until the debt was paid in full. Jennifer's family stated that any money received from him would immediately go to victims' rights organisations. In a shocking additional twist, just after the trial was completed, a videotape emerged of Robert, which was anonymously sent to a news channel. It was recorded on the 17th of December 1987, the month before the trial started. It featured Robert, his girlfriend Sean, and some other girls. In the video, Robert picks up a doll, turns to the camera, and in a strange high-pitched voice says, "My name is... Oops, I think I killed her," as he twisted the head off of the doll. Robert showed no remorse during a 1994 parole hearing, and due to various infractions whilst in prison, he served the full sentence of 15 years before being released on the 14th of February 2003. His girlfriend, Shawn Coville, was waiting for him. Robert gave one interview after his release where he continued to claim that Jennifer's death had been an accident. Robert and Shawn then moved to Georgia for a while before returning to New York and falling back into their old lifestyle of heavy drug use. The pair were arrested multiple times over the next few years, and then in 2007 they were arrested and charged with selling cocaine and heroin out of their apartment. Shawn was sent to rehab, but Robert, who was also charged with assault, received a prison sentence. In 2008, he was sentenced to 19 years in prison for selling drugs, 4 years more than the maximum amount of time he received for taking Jennifer's life. His earliest parole date will be the 25th of January 2024, when he will be 57 years old. Jennifer's mother, Ellen, founded the non-profit lobby group Justice for All in 1993. In her 10 years with the group, she was instrumental in getting 13 pieces of legislation passed which assist and support the victims of crime. That concludes today's story. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Please add any comments down below about the case. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. In 2018, Robert's godfather, Archbishop McCarrick, was removed from public ministry due to credible and substantiated allegations of sexual abuse against both adults and minors. Goodbye.